The sound of metal screaming against the ancient oak tree tore through the silence of the 4 o'clock hour at our Atlanta estate. It was not a simple fender bender. It was a violent crunch that echoed like a gunshot across the manicured lawns. I did not scream. I did not rush to the hallway in a panic. Instead, I sat up slowly in my bed and felt the cool silk of my sheets against my skin. For a woman who works 80 hours a week as a self-made chief executive officer, silence is a luxury. But tonight, the chaos was a melody I had been expecting. I walked to my window on the second floor and looked down at the circular driveway. The massive oak tree, a landmark of this property, now had a wreckage embedded in its trunk. Steam hissed from the crushed hood and the headlights flickered like dying stars. I watched from the shadows as the driver's side door groaned open. Kendrick, my brother-in-law, stumbled out into the humid night air. He was swaying, clearly intoxicated, and his expensive suit was disheveled. He did not check on the passenger. Instead, he hurried to the other side and pulled my sister Imani out of the seat. She was limp, appearing more dazed than injured. I watched with a cold fascination as Kendrick began to drag her toward the driver's side. He was staging the scene. He wanted the world to believe that his pregnant wife had been the one behind the wheel while he played the role of the distraught husband. It was a classic move from his tired playbook. He was a man who spent his life hiding behind the women who carried his weight. As I stood there, I felt a faint smile touch my lips. They thought they had finally won. They thought they had successfully stolen the keys to my brand new silver Porsche and taken it for a joyride that ended in disaster. They believed they had destroyed my hard-earned pride and joy. But as the moonlight hit the wreckage, the truth became clear to me. The vehicle wrapped around that tree was not my Porsche. It was the old Ford Explorer that belonged to my mother. It was a vehicle with no insurance and a failing engine. Earlier that evening, I had anticipated their greed. I had quietly swapped the keys in the designer bowl near the front door. I put the Ford keys into the Porsche fob and hid my actual car 3 blocks away. Kendrick and Imani had stolen a lemon thinking it was a diamond. In the darkness of my room, I realized that the trap was set. Their own entitlement had led them straight into a financial and legal nightmare that they would never see coming. I remained silent and waited for the sun to rise. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy oak door to my bedroom did not just open, it exploded against the wall. Mama Evie stormed in with the fury of 1,000 storms. Before I could even push myself up from my pillows or blink the sleep from my eyes, her hand arched through the air and connected with my face. The slap was so violent that my head snapped to the side and the copper taste of blood instantly filled my mouth. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply sat there in the terrifying silence while my cheek burned like a branding iron. Mama Evie stood over me with her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. She began to scream that I was the most selfish daughter God had ever put on this earth. She accused me of being irresponsible because I had left my car keys in the open where Imani could easily reach them. She shouted that my arrogance had nearly killed my sister and her unborn child in a horrible accident. The room soon filled with the rest of the vultures. Kendrick stood by the door and wiped fake tears from his eyes while playing the role of the broken hero. He whispered that he had tried to stop Imani, but she was too distraught to listen. Imani followed behind him and collapsed into a chair while clutching her stomach and sobbing about the trauma of the crash. It was a perfectly choreographed performance. They were a united front of lies against my solitary truth. Mama Evie grabbed my shoulders and shook me while demanding that I fix the mess I had created. She told me that I would be the one to call my private insurance company and tell them I was the driver. She insisted that I use my personal savings to cover every single penny of the $85,000 it would cost to replace the vehicle and repair the property. Kendrick stepped forward and had the audacity to say that this was my chance to finally prove I cared about this family. He told me that my money was worthless if I could not use it to protect my own flesh and blood from a criminal record. They were suffocating me with their manufactured guilt. They wanted me to pay for a crime Kendrick committed and a car that actually belonged to my mother. I looked at their faces and saw no love, only greed, and a desperate need to keep their illusions alive. I touched my throbbing cheek and realized that they had just handed me the final reason to destroy them all. I agreed to their terms with a quiet voice, while knowing that their victory was nothing but a mirage. The dining room table was set with fine china and the smell of expensive coffee, but the air was thick with the stench of manipulation. Mama Evie sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a court of thieves. She clutched a leather-bound Bible in one hand and a blank check in the other. She looked at me with eyes that suggested her divinity, while she preached about the sacred bonds of family and the importance of being our brother's keeper. She told me that God blessed those who gave with a joyful heart, and that my success was a gift intended to be shared with those less fortunate, specifically my sister. She pushed the check toward me and demanded that I write the amount of $85,000 to cover the damages and the secret debt Kendrick had accumulated. She claimed that family was the only thing that mattered in this cold world, and that turning my back now would be a sin that no amount of prayer could wash away. I looked at the gold-rimmed plate in front of me and felt the weight of 20 years of sacrifice pressing down on my shoulders. I reminded her of the time when I was 18 years old and had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Mama Evie had looked me in the eye then and told me that my dreams had to wait because Imani needed to attend a private high school to feel special. She had forced me to decline that scholarship and work double shifts as a waitress in a greasy diner to pay for her tuition. My youth was spent serving others, while Imani was draped in designer clothes and shielded from the reality of hard work. My mother did not deny it. She simply shrugged her shoulders and said that as the eldest daughter, my sacrifice was not a choice, but a natural obligation. She spoke as if my life was merely a fuel source for the fires of their comfort. Kendrick leaned back in his chair and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through my memories. He pointed a silver fork at me and told me to get off my high horse. He sneered that my position as a chief executive officer was nothing more than a stroke of pure luck, and that anyone could have done what I did if they had the same opportunities. He had the nerve to say that I owed every penny of my wealth to this family because their constant demands had made me tough enough to survive the corporate world. He claimed that my bank account was a family asset and that I was merely the temporary custodian of the money he and Imani deserved to spend. The entitlement in his voice was like a physical blow, yet I remained calm. I picked up the pen and prepared to sign the check because I knew that every dollar I gave them today was a nail in the coffin of their future. After the interrogation at the breakfast table, I retreated to my sanctuary on the second floor, but the sanctity of my private space had already been violated. I stood silently in the doorway of my dressing room and watched a scene of pure desperation. Imani was on her knees, frantically tossing my silk scarves and velvet boxes onto the floor. Her hands were trembling as she reached for the hidden compartment at the back of my jewelry safe. She finally pulled out a small, worn mahogany box. Inside lay the heirloom diamond necklace that our grandmother had smuggled out of the South during the Great Migration. It was the only thing grandmother had left specifically for me, a symbol of resilience, and the only piece of my heritage that had not been pawned by my mother or stolen by my sister. I cleared my throat and Imani nearly jumped out of her skin. She clutched the necklace to her chest and looked at me with eyes full of artificial tears. Instead of apologizing, she stood up and straightened her back with an incredible sense of entitlement. She told me that I already had enough success and shiny things to last 10 lifetimes. She claimed that she needed this necklace to comfort her spirit after the trauma of the car accident. She had the nerve to say that the diamonds would help her feel beautiful again while she carried her baby, as if a piece of jewelry could heal the lies she was telling. She argued that since I was the rich sister, I should not be so greedy about a single heirloom. She said it was only fair that she take it as a form of emotional compensation for the stress I had caused by being so difficult about the money. I did not scream or try to snatch the box back. I maintained a calm expression and even managed a small, tired nod of my head. I told her that if she truly believed the necklace would bring her peace, then she should take it. Imani did not hesitate for a single second. She tucked the mahogany box into her robe and hurried past me without a word of gratitude. What she did not know was that the small smoke detector on the ceiling was actually a high-definition hidden camera. I had installed it months ago after noticing my designer bags were disappearing. Every second of her theft, Every word of her twisted justification and every greedy movement of her hands was recorded in crystal clear digital quality. This was the muscle I needed for my plan. I watched the live feed on my phone and felt a cold clarity. Her greed was a bottomless pit, and she had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to strip her of everything. I met Sterling at a quiet, dimly lit bistro far from the prying eyes of the Atlanta social circles. Sterling had been my attorney and my most trusted confidant for over 10 years, a man who understood that in our world paper trails spoke louder than words. He sat across from me with a thick manila folder and a look of professional sorrow in his eyes. He pushed a set of documents toward me and revealed the shocking truth that I had suspected for months. The very house we lived in the grand estate that Mama Evie claimed was her fortress and our family legacy had been legally foreclosed upon 6 months ago. My mother had accumulated massive gambling debts and unpaid property taxes that totaled over $400,000. She had kept this a secret from everyone, choosing to drown in silence rather than admit her failure to me. The documents showed that the bank had been days away from putting the house on the auction block when a private holding company stepped in to purchase the entire deed in cash. Sterling looked me directly in the eye and confirmed that my own shell company was now the sole owner of the property. I had spent nearly $1 million to buy my own childhood home just to keep us from being thrown onto the street. As I looked at the signature lines, a sharp pain blossomed in my chest that no amount of money could soothe. It was a profound internal conflict that left me feeling hollow. I was devastated by the realization that my mother would rather lose everything to a faceless bank or a complete stranger than humble herself enough to ask me for help in a kind and honest way. She treated me like a bottomless ATM for Imani and Kendrick, yet she refused to trust me with the truth of our home. Her pride was a wall so high that it had completely blocked out her love for me. She was willing to let us all become homeless as long as she could maintain the illusion that she was still in control. Sterling reached across the table and placed his hand on mine, asking if I was ready to execute the next phase of the plan. I looked at the foreclosure notices and the secret purchase agreement. I realized then that I was no longer a daughter in that house. I was a landlord living with squatters who had no respect for the roof I provided. The betrayal was complete, and the time for mercy had ended. I told Sterling to prepare the formal eviction papers and keep them ready for the night of the gala. I sat alone in my home office with the lights dimmed, the blue glow of my laptop screen illuminating the cold determination on my face. I inserted the small memory card from the dash cam of the ruined Ford Explorer. The file loaded, and suddenly the events of that night played back in high definition. The video did not lie. It showed Kendrick behind the wheel, his eyes bloodshot, and a wicked grin plastered across his face. Imani sat in the passenger seat not as a victim, but as an active participant in the chaos. The audio was even more devastating than the images. I heard them laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me. Kendrick joked that they would cook my bank account for every dollar I had, and Imani giggled while saying that I was too weak to ever stand up to Mama Evie. They planned the entire narrative of the accident before they even hit the tree. They were celebrating the destruction of my property as if it were a winning lottery ticket. My phone vibrated on the desk, cutting through the sound of their recorded laughter. It was a call from Kendrick. I answered without saying a word, and his voice came through the speaker dripping with a new level of malice. He did not ask how I was doing or offer an apology. Instead, he issued a cold and calculated threat. He told me that I had 24 hours to go to the local dealership and purchase a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle in his name. He claimed that the stress of the accident and my constant questioning were taking a physical toll on Imani. He warned me that if I did not comply, he would tell the doctors and Mama Evie that Imani was having serious pregnancy complications caused entirely by the emotional distress I was inflicting on her. He was using his own unborn child as a pawn to blackmail me into silence and submission. The escalation of his cruelty was breathtaking. He told me that if anything happened to that baby, the blood would be on my hands and the entire community would know that I was a cold-hearted monster who valued money over life. I listened to his voice and felt a strange sense of relief. Any lingering doubt about my plan vanished in that moment. He thought he was tightening a noose around my neck, but he was actually handing me the rope for his own downfall. I told him in a very calm voice that I understood exactly what he was saying. I did not argue or defend myself. I simply recorded the entire phone call on my secondary device. As I hung up, I looked at the video of them laughing and the recording of his threat. I had everything I needed to finish this. The day of the charity gala arrived with a frantic energy that filled every corner of the house. Mama Evie and Imani spent the entire afternoon transforming the living room into a private dressing suite. They had used my credit card to purchase 2 custom silk gowns that cost over $12,000 each. I watched from the hallway as they draped themselves in luxury, their laughter echoing through the halls like a mocking song. They did not treat me like the person who provided the roof over their heads or the food on their table. Instead, they treated me like a common servant in my own home. Mama Evie barked orders at me to steam the delicate fabric of her train and demanded that I fetch her crystal heels from the closet. Imani complained that I was not moving fast enough and told me that my only job today was to stay out of the way so the important people could shine. They spoke about me as if I were invisible, a mere tool to be used and then discarded once the night was over. While they were busy admiring their reflections in the gilded mirrors, I was in my library completing a very different kind of preparation. I spent the afternoon organizing the legal eviction notices that Sterling had finalized for me. Each document was a cold, hard fact printed on heavy paper stating that every occupant of this house had 72 hours to vacate the premises. I also prepared 3 identical silver universal serial bus drives. These small devices contained the high-definition footage of the crash, the recordings of the blackmail threats Kendrick had made, and the bank records showing how they had drained my accounts. I felt a strange sense of calm as I tucked the legal papers into a sleek black leather folder and placed the drives in my evening clutch. They were preparing for a night of social triumph and empty praise, but I was preparing for a tactical strike that would dismantle their entire world. Mama Evie walked into my library without knocking and sneered at my simple black dress. She told me that I looked like a funeral director and that I should try to smile more so I would not embarrass the family in front of the high society donors. I looked her in the eye and told her that I was dressed exactly for the occasion I had planned. She did not understand the weight of my words. She simply adjusted her diamond earrings, which I had paid for, and walked away toward the waiting limousine. I followed them out of the house and felt the cold air hit my face. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act of their long history of betrayal. I was no longer the daughter or the sister they could manipulate. I was the architect of their reckoning. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was a sea of black excellence filled with the influential elite of Atlanta, dressed in tuxedos and sparkling gowns. Kendrick took the stage with a confidence that nauseated me, holding a microphone as if he were a king. He began to deliver a rehearsed speech about the sanctity of family love and the resilience required to overcome unexpected tragedies. He spoke about Imani as a fragile flower and himself as her protector, even hinting that they had suffered a great loss due to the negligence of others. The audience applauded, moved by his performance of the grieving hero. Mama Evie sat at the front table, wiping a fake tear from her eye while looking around to ensure the wealthy donors were watching her piety. It was a masterpiece of deception, a shining monument built on a foundation of lies. When Kendrick finished, he invited me to the stage to present the family donation. I walked up the stairs with a steady pace, holding the silver drive in my hand instead of a paper check. I did not look at Kendrick. I walked straight to the technician at the media booth and handed him the drive, telling him there had been a change in the presentation. Suddenly, the giant screens behind the podium flickered to life. The room fell into a deathly silence as the high-definition footage of the crash played for everyone to see. The elite guests watched in horror as Kendrick stumbled out of the driver's side and dragged a dazed Imani into his place. Then the video shifted to the footage of Imani stealing our grandmother's diamond necklace while laughing about my stupidity. The audio from Kendrick's blackmail call blasted through the professional sound system, his voice cold and cruel, as he threatened to harm his own child's reputation for an $85,000 SUV. The explosion of shock in the room was deafening. The whispers turned into shouts of disgust as the prominent leaders of our community witnessed the absolute depravity of the couple on stage. Mama Evie's face turned a ghostly shade of gray as her social standing vanished in an instant. Just as Kendrick tried to scramble toward the exit, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. Sterling had timed it perfectly. 4 police officers marched down the center aisle, their uniforms a stark contrast to the formal wear. They intercepted Kendrick before he could reach the stairs. They informed him loudly that he was under arrest for felony hit and run, filing a false police report, and insurance fraud. The sound of the metal handcuffs clicking into place echoed off the marble walls. I stood at the podium and looked down at my family, realizing that the glitter had finally been stripped away to reveal the rot underneath. The ride back to the estate was filled with a silence so heavy it felt like lead. Imani sat in the corner of the limousine, her expensive gown torn, and her face a ruined mask of smeared makeup and genuine terror. Mama Evie stared out the window, her hands trembling so violently that the diamonds on her fingers clattered together. When we stepped inside the grand foyer, the air felt different. It felt like the end of an era. I did not wait for them to start their excuses. I walked straight to the mahogany console table and threw the thick black leather folder onto the surface. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood was like a gavel in a courtroom. I told Mama Evie to open it. With shaking fingers, she read the documents that proved she had lost the house to foreclosure 6 months ago. She gasped as she saw the deed of sale showing that my shell company was the legal owner of every brick and blade of grass on this property. Mama Evie let out a choked sob and collapsed onto her knees right there on the marble floor. The woman who had once slapped me for her own mistakes was now a broken shadow of herself. She looked up at me with eyes full of a desperation I had never seen, realizing for the first time that she was not the master of this house. I did not offer her a hand. I stood over her and delivered my ultimatum in a voice as cold as a winter morning. I told them both that they had exactly 72 hours to pack their belongings and vacate the premises. I made it very clear that there would be no exceptions, no extensions, and no mercy. No. I told Imani that she could find Kendrick in a jail cell, and they could figure out their future from there. The luxury life they had built on the foundation of my labor was officially over. The house was suddenly filled with the sound of Mama Evie's wailing. She crawled toward me, clutching at the hem of my dress and begging for forgiveness in the name of the Lord and the sanctity of blood. She screamed that she was my mother, and that I could not cast her out into the street like a common stranger. She promised to change and swore that she would never treat me with such disrespect again. I looked down at her and felt absolutely nothing. The years of being their scapegoat and their bank account had turned my heart into a fortress. I pulled my dress from her grasp without saying a single word of comfort. I turned my back on her cries and began to walk up the grand staircase. Each step I took was a step toward a life where I was finally free. I reached the top of the stairs and disappeared into the shadows of the second floor, while the echoes of her pleading followed me like a ghost. The 72 hours passed like a fever dream that finally broke. I stood on the edge of the circular driveway and watched the moving truck pull away, carrying the last remnants of a life built on shadows and theft. Mama Evie and Imani were gone, leaving behind nothing but an echoing silence and the faint scent of expensive perfume that they could no longer afford. I did not feel the sting of regret or the weight of loneliness. Instead, I felt a profound sense of lightness, as if a mountain had been lifted from my chest. I looked at the grand house one last time, the house I had purchased in secret to save them, and I realized it was never truly a home. It was just a beautiful cage where I had been the captive provider. I had already signed the closing papers to sell the estate to a young family who would fill it with genuine laughter instead of calculated lies. I walked to the detached garage and pressed the remote. The heavy door rose to reveal my true silver Porsche, the car they thought they had destroyed, but had never even touched. The engine roared to life with a purr of pure power, a sound that represented my freedom and my labor. I slid into the hand-stitched leather seat and felt the cool air of the evening on my skin. I did not look back as I shifted into gear and drove down the long, winding path away from the oak tree that still bore the scars of their betrayal. I was 30 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was not responsible for anyone else's happiness or survival. I was no longer the scapegoat or the bank account. I was simply Brielle, a woman who had reclaimed her soul from the vultures of her own bloodline. As I reached the highway, the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the Atlanta sky in shades of deep purple and gold. I pushed the accelerator and felt the car surge forward, leaving the ghosts of my past in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was wide and open, stretching toward a future where respect was a requirement and loyalty was earned. I realized that the most expensive weapon I ever owned was not my wealth, but my silence and my ability to walk away. I drove toward the sunset with a peaceful heart, knowing that the price of my new life was high, but the cost of staying would have been my very existence. I was finally free, and the air had never tasted so sweet. True family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the respect and loyalty that lives in the heart. We often set ourselves on fire to keep others warm, only to realize they are enjoying the glow of our destruction. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal. It is an act of spiritual survival. You are not a recovery fund for people who refuse to value you. Your peace is a sanctuary that no one has the right to violate regardless of their title in your life. Remember, sometimes walking away is the highest form of self-love.